There are departures that do not sound like doors closing, but like something deeper, an inner system shutting down. When you leave a narcissist alone, you are not simply walking away from a person. You are withdrawing the attention that once held together their sense of identity. And in that absence, something unexpected begins to unfold. What looks like confidence from the outside is revealed as dependence on reflection, and what seemed like strength slowly starts to lose its shape when there is no longer anyone left to perform for. They do not grieve love in the way a heartbroken soul might grieve a genuine connection. Their sorrow is not rooted in tenderness or remembrance of shared warmth. What unsettles them is far more fragile and far less romantic. It is the quiet realization that control has slipped beyond their reach. The structure they depended on, where their words shaped your emotions and your reactions validated their presence, no longer responds to them. In their world, love was never simply love. It was influence, it was response, it was the ability to move another person's inner world with minimal effort. And so when you leave, what they experience is not the absence of affection, but the absence of power. The room once filled with your attention becomes unfamiliar, almost hostile, because it no longer reflects them back in the way they are used to seeing themselves. At first, they may not recognize what is happening. They may reach out in familiar ways, expecting the same emotional doors to open. They may speak with confidence or even irritation, as if your distance is something temporary, something that will bend again under persistence. But silence has a way of educating even those who refuse to learn quickly, and your silence begins to teach them a language they have long avoided, the language of limitation. As time passes, something shifts inside them. It is not dramatic, but it is steady. The absence of your response becomes a kind of mirror they cannot control, and in that mirror, their usual reflections begin to blur. Without your emotional engagement, their narratives lose their audience. Without your attention, their performance loses its stage. And slowly, what remains is not admiration or connection, but uncertainty. They begin to search for substitutes, for new reflections that might restore the feeling of importance they once took for granted. But nothing quite fits, because what they are truly searching for is not another person. It is the version of themselves that only existed in your attention, and that version does not survive outside of your presence. Meanwhile, you begin to return to yourself in ways that are quiet but irreversible. The space they once occupied in your thoughts starts to clear. The emotional noise they once triggered begins to fade, and in that clearing, something stronger takes shape: clarity. You see the pattern not as confusion anymore, but as structure. You understand what was taken and what was given away. For them, this becomes the beginning of internal unrest, not because you are causing it, but because you are no longer available to prevent it. The collapse is not loud. It is the slow disappearance of an identity built on reaction, now left without a responding voice. And in that silence, they are left with something they were never prepared to face. Not your anger, not your pain, but your absence that no longer turns back toward them. Your absence becomes a mirror they can no longer manipulate or distort. And for someone who has long depended on shaping how they are seen through your reactions, this mirror is not comforting. It is unsettling in its honesty. It reflects nothing more than what remains when influence is removed, when emotional responses are no longer available to adjust, soften, or validate their image. In that stillness, they are no longer meeting you. They are meeting the outline of themselves without your interpretation. At first, they may try to change what they see in that silence. They may rewrite the story in their mind, casting themselves as the one who was wronged, misunderstood, or undervalued. This is not unusual for a mind that struggles to sit with emotional absence. But even those narratives begin to lose their strength when there is no one left to respond to them, no one left to argue, no one left to confirm or deny. A story spoken into emptiness begins to echo differently. It returns without resistance, and in that return, it becomes harder to avoid the truth beneath it. The mirror you leave behind does not flatter, and it does not attack. It simply remains, and in remaining, it reveals something that was once hidden behind constant interaction, the dependence on external reflection for internal stability. Without your attention to soften their edges or amplify their presence, they are left with a version of themselves that feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. They may attempt to break the mirror, to replace it, to find new reflections that restore the sense of control they once had. But what they discover, slowly and reluctantly, is that it was never about the mirror itself. It was about the need to see themselves as significant through someone else's emotional response. And when that response no longer arrives, the reflection does not adjust. It simply stays unchanged. Meanwhile, your absence continues to exist without effort. It does not chase, it does not explain, it does not return to be reshaped. It simply holds its place. And in doing so, it creates a space they cannot fill in the way they once did. That space becomes a quiet teacher, showing them what it feels like when attention is no longer automatic, when emotional supply is no longer available on demand. Over time, what unsettles them most is not anger or rejection, but irrelevance. The realization that they can no longer alter your emotional state becomes more difficult than any confrontation, because manipulation loses its meaning when there is no longer participation in it. And without participation, even the most practiced patterns begin to lose direction. And so the mirror remains not as punishment, but as consequence. It reflects only what is present, not what is desired. And in that reflection, they are left to sit with a version of themselves that no longer depends on your eyes to exist. When you stop reacting, something subtle but profound begins to shift in the emotional structure they once relied on. It is not that they immediately understand it or even recognize it for what it is. At first, they may interpret your silence as stubbornness, as distance, as something temporary that will eventually bend under the weight of familiarity. But what they do not realize is that your reaction was never just a response. It was part of the framework that held their sense of self together. For a long time, their identity was not fully contained within themselves. It was partially constructed through your emotional responses, your concern, your frustration, your attention, your attempts to understand. Each reaction, whether soft or intense, confirmed to them that they were still central in your inner world. And when someone becomes accustomed to being reflected in that way, they begin to unconsciously depend on it, like a mirror they visit to remember who they are. So when you stop reacting, the reflection disappears. At first, the absence feels like a delay, something they can restore with the right words or the right tone. But when nothing they do brings back the familiar emotional echo, confusion begins to settle in. And beneath that confusion is something more unsettling, disorientation. Because without your reactions, the version of themselves they were used to seeing starts to lose consistency. They may try to recreate it. They may provoke, reach, withdraw, return again with different strategies, all in an attempt to trigger the emotional response that once stabilized their internal narrative. But each attempt meets a quieter space than before. And in that quiet space, something unexpected happens. The image they held of themselves begins to lose its edges. Identity, when it has been repeatedly reinforced through external reaction, does not collapse loudly. It fragments slowly. Piece by piece, the certainty they once carried begins to feel less automatic. The role they once played in your emotional world no longer has an audience. And without an audience, the performance loses its structure. What remains is not immediate emptiness, but instability. Moments where they feel certain of themselves, followed by moments where that certainty fades without explanation. This is the beginning of fracture, not dramatic, but internal, a quiet questioning of why the usual patterns no longer produce the usual outcomes, and still you do not react. That absence becomes the most powerful shift of all. Because without resistance, without engagement, without emotional participation, there is nothing left to anchor the identity that was partially built through you. What they once took for granted as a stable sense of self begins to feel less stable, less predictable, less reinforced. In time, they are left facing something unfamiliar, a version of themselves that is no longer being continuously shaped by your responses. And in that space, the fracture is not something you caused. It is something that was revealed the moment the mirror stopped answering back. After your absence settles in, there is often a quiet but restless search that begins. Not always loud, not always visible, but persistent in its own way. They may move toward new connections, new conversations, new attention, as if something external can restore what has internally shifted. On the surface, it can look like replacement, but beneath it, there is a different reality unfolding. What they are truly reaching for is not simply another person, but the emotional atmosphere that once surrounded you. The way your attention once carried weight, the way your reactions once made them feel central, significant, even powerful. That kind of emotional supply is not just interaction, it becomes reinforcement of identity. And when that specific reinforcement is gone, what replaces it rarely feels equivalent. New sources of attention may arrive, but they do not arrive with the same depth of emotional history. They do not carry the same familiarity, the same internal reference points, the same patterns that were built over time. So even when attention is present, it often feels slightly off, slightly insufficient, like a substitute that cannot fully replicate what was lost. This is where the discomfort begins to surface more clearly, because what they are comparing is not just people, it is emotional resonance. And resonance built over time cannot be instantly recreated elsewhere. The nervous system remembers patterns, expectations, and responses that were once predictable. When those patterns are no longer met in the same way, there is a kind of internal imbalance that external noise cannot fully fix. They may try to increase intensity, to accelerate connection, to recreate urgency in new places, but urgency without depth eventually exhausts itself, and attention without emotional grounding begins to feel temporary, even hollow. It becomes something consumed quickly, but not something that stabilizes anything within. Meanwhile, your absence remains steady, not competing, not adjusting, not responding. And in contrast to that steadiness, everything else begins to feel slightly unstable. This contrast is what quietly intensifies the sense of loss, not because you are actively present elsewhere, but because you are no longer available in the way they once relied upon. Over time, something becomes clearer to them, even if they do not fully admit it. It is not that attention has disappeared from their life. It is that a particular kind of emotional supply, the kind that once came with consistency, history, and reaction, cannot be easily duplicated. It was never just about being seen. It was about how they were reflected through you repeatedly in ways that reinforced a specific internal image. And when that reflection no longer exists, everything else begins to feel slightly less real, slightly less anchored, slightly less capable of filling the space it once held. What often appears as certainty in them is not always rooted in something stable. It can look like confidence, firm voice, steady posture, persuasive presence, but beneath that surface, there can be a structure that depends heavily on external validation to remain intact. When that validation is present, everything seems aligned. When it is removed, even quietly, what was held together by attention begins to feel less secure. This is why your absence does not simply register as distance. It removes a reinforcing layer they may not have fully acknowledged they depended on. Without that layer, what remains is not instantly visible collapse, but a subtle exposure of something unsteady underneath the presentation. The tone may stay the same, the words may still be carefully chosen, but the internal grounding begins to shift. At first, they may compensate. People often do when faced with a loss of emotional reflection. They may become more expressive, more assertive, more certain in their communication. Not because their confidence has deepened, but because something inside feels slightly less anchored, and effort is used to recreate what once felt natural. It is a form of adjustment, though not always a conscious one. But over time, effort alone cannot fully replace what was once reinforced by consistent emotional response. There is a difference between being confident in oneself and being confident in how one is being received. When the second begins to fade, the first is often tested in quiet ways. Moments of pause, hesitation, or overcompensation can begin to appear where ease once existed. This is where the instability becomes more noticeable, not as a dramatic breakdown, but as inconsistency. A fluctuation between appearing fully composed and then slightly unsettled when the expected response does not arrive. The absence of your reflection becomes a space where certainty is no longer automatically confirmed. And in that space, something deeper is revealed, not immediately to others, and sometimes not even fully to themselves. It is the realization that confidence, when repeatedly supported by external response, can feel strong without being entirely self-sustained. When that external response changes or disappears, the internal structure is left to stand on its own. What once felt like solidity begins to require maintenance. What once felt natural begins to require effort. And what once seemed effortless begins to reveal its dependence on interaction. Meanwhile, your absence continues without adjustment. It does not soften itself to restore balance. It does not return to stabilize what feels unsteady. It simply remains outside of their influence. And in that contrast, the difference between true internal grounding and externally supported identity becomes more apparent over time. What they are left facing is not just your absence, but the space where reinforcement used to be. And in that space, the instability is not loud. It is quiet, persistent, and difficult to fully ignore once it has been noticed. Without your attention, their importance starts to dissolve in ways that are not immediate but gradual and deeply unsettling. At first, it may not even be recognized as loss. Life continues, conversations continue, appearances remain intact. Yet something subtle begins to shift beneath the surface of how they experience themselves in the world. Importance for them was never only an internal conviction. It was often reinforced through interaction, through being noticed, responded to, emotionally engaged with. Your attention in that dynamic was not just presence, it was confirmation. It was the quiet signal that they mattered in a way that felt reflected back to them through your reactions. And when that reflection disappears, the sense of importance begins to lose its external support. What follows is not always an immediate collapse, but a slow thinning. Moments that once felt significant may begin to feel less anchored. Conversations that once carried weight may no longer produce the same internal response. Even their own words, once shaped with the expectation of emotional impact, begin to land differently when that impact is no longer guaranteed. There is a kind of adjustment that happens in silence, not all at once, and not in a way that is easily admitted. It is felt more than it is spoken, a subtle need to recalibrate how they are seen, how they are received, how they are held in the awareness of others. Because when one source of reflection is removed, the mind instinctively searches for another way to restore balance. But replacement does not always restore equivalence. New attention may arrive, but it does not carry the same emotional history. It does not mirror the same depth of familiarity, the same patterns of expectation that were built over time. So even when they are seen by others, there can remain a quiet sense that something essential is missing from the way they are being experienced. This is where importance begins to feel less like a fixed identity and more like something that must be maintained. It is no longer automatic. It requires effort, reinforcement, and sometimes performance. And anything that requires constant maintenance begins to reveal its dependency. Meanwhile, your absence remains unchanged. It does not adjust to soften the impact. It does not return to restore what has shifted. It simply continues as absence without participation in the emotional structure they once relied upon. And that lack of participation becomes its own kind of pressure. Over time, what dissolves is not their existence, but the certainty of how that existence is reflected back to them. The feeling of being naturally central, naturally significant, naturally confirmed begins to weaken, and in its place, there is a quieter awareness that importance is not only something felt internally, but something once reinforced externally in ways they can no longer fully recreate. There is often a return, but it does not always carry the meaning people assume it does. It may come quietly, unexpectedly, or even carefully timed, as though nothing has changed. Words may be softened, memories may be revisited, and old familiarity may be attempted as if it still exists in the same form. But what drives this return is not always connection. It is often withdrawal. Withdrawal is not emotional reunion. It is discomfort with absence. It is the nervous system reacting to the loss of a familiar source of validation, attention, or emotional engagement. When someone has been accustomed to a certain kind of reflection from another person, its sudden disappearance can create an internal imbalance that seeks correction. And so, the return is not always about rebuilding love, but about restoring a familiar emotional state that once regulated how they felt about themselves. At first, it may present itself gently, even thoughtfully. There may be reflection, apology, or nostalgia, but underneath those expressions, there can be a quieter urgency, the need to feel again what was once easily accessible. Not necessarily the person themselves, but the emotional response that person once provided. That distinction is often subtle, but it changes the entire meaning of the return. Because what is being sought is not always mutual reconnection, it is relief. Relief from the discomfort of being without a familiar emotional mirror. And when that mirror is no longer available in the same way, there is a tendency to revisit the space where it once existed, hoping something of it still remains unchanged. But absence changes things. It reshapes emotional landscapes. It creates distance not only between people, but between versions of people that once only existed in relation to each other. And so, when the return meets a space that no longer responds in the same way, there is often confusion, not always spoken, but felt. The expectation of familiarity meets the reality of transformation. This is where withdrawal becomes more visible. Because when the expected emotional response does not return, the discomfort that was temporarily eased begins to surface again. The return then reveals its true nature, not as resolution, but as interruption in the experience of absence. A brief attempt to stabilize what has already shifted into a different state. And yet, even in this pattern, something becomes clearer. The absence that once created discomfort on one side begins to create clarity on the other. What was once engaged in cycles of reaction is no longer participating in them. And without that participation, the emotional dynamic cannot fully reassemble itself in its previous form. So the return may happen, but it does not restore what has fundamentally changed. It only highlights that something familiar has been lost, and what remains is no longer shaped in the same way. And in that realization, withdrawal is no longer just about missing someone. It becomes the recognition that the emotional structure itself has already moved on from what it used to be. There is a moment in emotional separation when the most unexpected shift occurs. not in what is said, but in what no longer needs to be said. It is the moment when your healing stops being something they can interrupt, interpret, or influence. And in that silence, something within them begins to register a change they did not anticipate. You are no longer emotionally available in the way you once were. Your healing, in its quiet progression, does not announce itself as victory or defiance. It does not need to. It simply moves forward without reference to them. And that is what makes it so deeply disruptive to the structure they once relied on. Because when someone has been used to occupying space in another person's emotional world, even indirectly, the absence of that space being offered back to them creates a kind of internal disorientation. What once defined the connection was not only presence, but reaction. The push and pull of emotion, the responsiveness, the engagement, these were the channels through which identity was once reinforced on both sides. But when one side begins to heal, those channels gradually close, not in hostility, but in completion. And what replaces them is not anger, but independence. To them, this can feel unfamiliar, because independence does not offer reflection. It does not return emotional signals that confirm relevance. It simply exists, moving forward without reference to the past dynamic. And when someone who was once part of their emotional rhythm no longer participates in that rhythm, the absence becomes more noticeable than the presence ever was. This is where the wound forms, not in your healing itself, but in what your healing represents. It represents a shift in definition, a quiet but undeniable change in who holds emotional influence. You are no longer shaped by the same interactions that once kept the connection alive in its familiar form. And without that shaping, their role in your inner world diminishes. For someone who has depended, even unconsciously, on being emotionally central, this realization is difficult to process, because it removes them from a position they may have assumed was stable. It is not simply about losing contact. It is about losing significance in a space they once helped define. And yet, your healing continues without negotiation. It does not pause to acknowledge their discomfort. It does not adjust itself to preserve familiarity. It simply moves forward, steadily and quietly, toward a state where their influence no longer determines emotional direction. In that progression, something irreversible happens. The version of you that once required their emotional presence begins to dissolve, and in its place, a different version emerges, one that no longer organizes itself around their reaction, approval, or absence. That is why your healing becomes their deepest wound, not because it harms them directly, but because it confirms something they cannot easily control, that you are no longer defined by them in any emotional sense. And once that realization settles, it cannot be reversed by return, explanation, or memory. There is a moment in separation when the silence becomes more honest than any conversation ever was. When you are no longer there to react, to soften, to absorb, or to reflect, something unavoidable begins to surface in the space you once occupied. It is not dramatic at first. It does not arrive with clarity or understanding. It arrives slowly, like something being revealed, rather than something being created. In your departure, they are no longer meeting your emotions, your responses, or your presence as a mirror. And without that mirror, there is no longer a way to project, to redirect, or to dilute what is internally present. What remains is not the version of themselves they curated for interaction, but the version that exists when interaction is removed. And that version is unfamiliar, not because it is new, but because it was never required to be fully seen before. This is where avoidance begins to lose its function. All the ways they once escaped inward discomfort, through attention, through validation, through distraction in emotional exchange, no longer operate in the same way. There is no longer a consistent external rhythm to override the internal one. And in that absence, what was previously avoided begins to surface with quiet persistence. At first, it may feel like restlessness, a need to reach outward, to restore something familiar, to recreate the emotional structure that once made everything feel more stable. But even when that effort is made, the response is no longer the same, because what has changed is not only access to you, but access to the version of themselves that only existed through your reflection. And so, without realizing it immediately, they begin to encounter something they have long moved around rather than through. Thoughts that were previously softened by distraction become more defined. Emotions that were previously redirected begin to settle without interruption. There is no immediate resolution in this, only awareness that something internal has been consistently deferred. This is where the truth becomes unavoidable, not because it is loud, but because it is no longer being covered. Without your presence to participate in the emotional pattern, there is no longer a shared space to distribute meaning. And in that unshared space, they are left alone with their own internal experience in a way that cannot be outsourced or redirected. What they meet then is not a punishment or a consequence in the dramatic sense, but a direct encounter with self-perception without external shaping. It is the removal of everything that once helped define how they felt about themselves through another person's emotional engagement. And in that state, something becomes clear in a way it never needed to be before. There is a difference between being seen and being reflected, between being present and being validated through reaction. When the reflection disappears, what remains is not emptiness, but reality without interference. That is the truth your departure quietly reveals, not about who you were to them, but about who they are when there is no longer anyone left to turn their attention into meaning.